When my father-in-law looked me straight in the eye and said he was cutting my salary in half, he thought he had finally cornered me. What he did not know was that, in that exact moment, I already had a new door open, a new title waiting, and a future his family no longer had the power to price. When my father-in-law, Richard Vale, looked directly at me across the conference room table and told me the company was cutting my salary in half, I could hear the satisfaction tucked behind every word. He was not merely announcing a financial decision. He was testing how much more humiliation I was willing to swallow. To him, I was the woman who had spent too many years inside his family's system. The woman who had grown accustomed to silence. The woman who kept the production lines alive while other people stood in the light. He expected panic. He expected me to think about the mortgage, my marriage, my age, and the more than 2 decades I had tied to Anderson Automotive, then force myself to accept the insult. But that morning, what Richard did not know was that I was no longer standing there as someone trapped. I had options. I had an offer. I had evidence of my own value. My name is Olivia Crane. I was 54 years old. And the morning, Richard believed he had finally put me in my place, became the best day of my professional life. I did not argue. I did not cry. I did not slam my hand against the table. I smiled. Because sometimes the strongest resistance is not making noise. Sometimes it is letting someone walk confidently into the mistake they have built for themselves. Richard's conference room always carried the same stale smell. Burnt coffee, mixed with the old money authority the Vale family wrapped around itself. He was already seated at the head of the table when I walked in, turning over papers, as though he were weighing something important. Even though I knew the outcome had already been decided, Richard was the kind of man who could sit still and still demand that the room orbit around him. There had been a time when I understood and even respected that. More than 2 decades earlier, when I first joined Anderson Automotive after graduating from Michigan Tech with a mechanical engineering degree, Richard had still been a demanding but practical boss. He knew what kept a plant alive. He understood what line efficiency meant on a Monday morning. He knew how a few minutes of delay could ripple into real cost. I was a 32-year-old woman then, carrying more ideas about lean production than most people at Anderson wanted to hear. And I had to prove, one step at a time, that I was not just theoretical. I worked my way through the shop floor, the supervisors, the suppliers, and the difficult customers. I did not have the Vale name on the building, but I was the one people called when a line went down before dawn, when workers needed a clear decision, and when customers needed a promise that meant something. The shift began when Ethan Vale came back to the company. Ethan was Richard's eldest son, 34 years old, newly returned with a Duke MBA, a laptop full of presentations, and a vocabulary polished with phrases like digital transformation, operational restructuring, and cost optimization. The problem was that he had never worked a full shift on a production floor. He could talk about a plant as if it were a diagram on a screen. But he did not know the smell of hydraulic oil, the rhythm change of a machine under strain, or the look on a worker's face when a component failed tolerance. 8 months after he returned, Ethan decided to replace the hydraulic component supplier I had personally vetted and maintained for 9 years. I remember the meeting clearly. He put up one slide with 2 numbers, the old supplier's price per unit and the new supplier's price per unit. The new number was lower. So in his mind, the decision was finished. I asked about lead times. He said they were within an acceptable range. I asked about tolerance specifications. He looked at me as if I were trying to complicate his brilliance. If you have ever watched an experienced person get dismissed simply because their last name was not on the building, comment number 1, so I know you understand that feeling. I went back to my office and ran the full numbers defect risk, setup impact, buffer inventory, and projected downtime. That afternoon, I sent Richard a 4-page report. In the email to Richard, I kept my message simple. I wrote that the decision would cost the company more than it saved, and that I had the data if he wanted to discuss it. 2 days later, he replied with 3 words, "Ethan is handling it." I still remember staring at those words on my screen. They did not surprise me. But something inside me went quiet. It was not because I feared Ethan might be wrong. I knew he was wrong. What chilled me was that Richard had chosen not to know. 6 weeks later, Ford's quality auditors arrived without warning. The defect rate on the most recent production run was 340% above specification. Ford rejected the entire shipment. $480,000 disappeared in one afternoon. The auditors were professional, but their faces said enough. This was not a random glitch. This was a systemic failure. In the emergency meeting afterward, Ethan sat across from me and Richard without a trace of alarm and said the quality control process should have caught the problem before shipment. According to him, it was a floor management issue. Floor management meant me. My 4-page report was still in my desk drawer, clearly dated. I did not pull it out. I simply nodded and said I understood his concern. Richard looked at his son, then looked at me, and said nothing. That silence told me exactly where the story was going. The salary cut that came later was not a shock. I had been watching the pieces move for months. Ethan and his younger brother, Mason Vale, had started appearing in every supplier meeting, every client review, and every conversation they had never cared about before. Mason came from finance and understood the production floor even less than Ethan did. But both brothers knew how to ask careful questions, take notes, and separate the relationships attached to the Vale name from the relationships built by a woman who showed up at 5 in the morning when the line stopped. After more than 2 decades of doing the actual work, the second list was much longer than they realized. The plan was simple. They wanted to squeeze me through compensation. If I became angry and resigned, I would leave behind the systems, suppliers, and customer trust I had built. If I stayed, they would treat that as proof that I had nowhere else to go. If this story makes you believe that a skilled worker should never be treated like a discounted asset, please like the video. Richard's greatest mistake was believing I had spent more than 2 decades becoming comfortable. The truth was that I had spent those years becoming valuable in ways he had never bothered to measure. Richard thought I would not push back because I had never pushed back loudly. He confused composure with weakness. He confused professionalism with obedience. He also confused staying at one company for a long time with having no value anywhere else. Over the years, I learned that the most dangerous changes inside a plant rarely begin with an explosion. They start with a small variance, a slightly different machine sound, or a manager ignoring a warning because the warning is inconvenient. I had been watching the Vale family that way. I saw Richard gradually choose bloodline over competence. I saw Ethan use modern language to cover the fact that he did not understand the foundation. I saw Mason treat relationships as numbers on a spreadsheet rather than trust earned through repeated delivery. And I saw myself, too. I saw a woman who had grown too used to watching her work carry someone else's name. I saw that I had been quiet too long. Not because I was incapable of pain, but because I believed results would eventually speak for themselves. But, in rooms like Richard's, results only speak when someone is willing to listen. When they refuse to listen, you take your value somewhere else. Somewhere you do not have to beg to be recognized. 8 weeks before Richard cut my salary, a phone call from California changed everything. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was in my office reviewing production variance reports when my personal phone rang. Unknown number. California area code. I almost let it go to voicemail. But I answered. The voice on the other end belonged to Caroline Walsh. She did not waste time. She said my name, introduced herself, and asked whether I had a few minutes to talk about my future. Just the phrase "my future" made me pause. It had been a long time since anyone at Anderson had asked what I wanted for my career. People simply assumed I would keep absorbing responsibility, keep fixing mistakes, and keep feeling grateful for a place inside the Vale family system. I pushed the reports aside and told her I had time. Caroline Walsh was a name that made procurement managers cautious and competitors nervous. She had not inherited an empire, and she had not married her way into authority. She built Walsh Manufacturing from a small California operation into one of the most efficient automotive suppliers in the country. She had the kind of operational eye I respected. She could read a production floor the way a physician reads an X-ray, seeing what others walked past without noticing. Caroline told me Walsh had been watching my work at Anderson for some time. She mentioned the lean systems I had implemented, the union relationship, the supplier network, and the defect reduction numbers my teams had achieved. What moved me was not that she knew the numbers. In this industry, competent people can find data. What made me sit still was that she said the people who had worked with me spoke about me differently than they spoke about Anderson Automotive. They spoke about me as the reason things worked. I am not easily softened by praise, but accurate recognition from someone who owes you nothing has a strange weight. I asked what she was proposing. Caroline answered, Vice President of Manufacturing Innovation. Full authority over production systems for the Midwest expansion. Compensation. 45% above my current salary. And equity tied to expansion performance. Then she added the line that told me she understood the situation perfectly. No one would second-guess my decisions just because their last name was on the building. If you want to keep following stories about women who rise after being underestimated, subscribe to the channel right now. Sometimes the right offer at the right moment does more than open a new job. It gives you back the feeling that your value was never gone. 2 weeks after that call, I met Caroline at Walsh's Detroit office. Walking into that facility felt like stepping into the version of manufacturing I had once hoped Anderson could become. Every line had real-time production monitoring. Predictive maintenance systems flagged equipment risks before they became downtime. Quality controls were built to prevent defects at the source, not merely catch them after the damage was done. But the people caught my attention most. Floor workers and engineers spoke to each other as if they were solving the same problem. Because they were. There was no quiet contempt between the people in button-down shirts and the people standing beside the machines. There was no management team that appeared only when blame needed a target. Caroline walked beside me and said this was what it looked like when a company invested in operations instead of merely managing them. I nodded because I understood exactly what she meant. I had spent nearly a decade trying to build something similar at Anderson. But every proposal that touched budget, control, or the Vale family ego had been trimmed, delayed, or turned into a slogan. At Walsh, I saw proof that a company could choose competence over bloodline, systems over performance, and the future over old authority. I told Caroline I needed a few weeks to think. That was only half true. Most of the thinking was finished by the time I walked out of the Detroit facility. What I truly needed was time to leave cleanly. I did not want to give Richard any reason to turn my departure into something ugly. I consulted an attorney, reviewed every clause, every limitation, and every legal boundary. Everything I brought to Walsh had to be mine ethically and legally: knowledge, experience, reputation, and relationships earned through personal trust. I did not take confidential documents. I did not copy proprietary lists. I did not recruit people behind the company's back. I simply prepared to prove something. Anderson had avoided acknowledging for too long. Much of what they called company property functioned because people trusted me. For 6 weeks, I documented everything I had built. Not to steal it, but to prove where it came from. I gathered timestamps, proposal, emails, ignored warnings, and records of weekend problems I had solved while Richard remained too far removed to notice. After more than 2 decades of watching other people receive credit for my work, I finally collected the receipts for myself. Danielle, my husband, noticed that something about me had changed, but he did not understand it. He was Richard's son, and although he was not directly involved in operations like Ethan or Mason, he had grown up in a world that revolved around his father. One evening, we sat across from each other at the kitchen table. He was scrolling through his tablet while I drank coffee that had already gone cold. He asked why I had been so quiet lately. I told him it was just end-of-quarter work. He nodded and asked whether his father was keeping me busy. I said something like that. He returned to his screen. I looked at him and felt a quiet sadness settle over me. I was only weeks away from the biggest professional decision of my life. And the man who had shared my home for more than 2 decades still assumed every movement in my life began with Richard. I did not entirely blame Daniel. That was the order he had been taught. His father ran the company. The company employed his wife. And I should be grateful for that arrangement. Perhaps the idea that I had my own plans, my own competence, and my own future had never fully crossed his mind. I did not argue that night. I said goodnight, went into my office, opened the Walsh offer letter again, and read each line like confirmation that I still belonged to myself. During that period, I made 5 phone calls, not to recruit anyone, and not to damage Anderson. I simply informed a few long-standing professional contacts, quietly and properly, that I was preparing to move in a new direction. I called Sharon Torres at Parker Precision, Clint Ruiz at Midwest Distribution, Brenda Sloan at Parker Automotive Systems, and 2 others. I did not ask them to follow me. I did not suggest what they should do. But when you have built relationships by keeping your word for more than 2 decades, some things do not have to be said directly. Brenda listened, exhaled, and told me that, honestly, I was the only reason they had stayed with Anderson as long as they had. I thanked her and kept the call brief. Within 10 days, 4 of those 5 contacts reached out to Caroline Walsh on their own. I did not arrange it. I did not push it. It happened because, in manufacturing, real relationships are not built by a logo on a contract. They are built by the person who answers the phone at midnight, finds replacement components when a line is about to stop, tells the truth when risk appears, and takes responsibility when everyone else wants distance from the hard part. Richard believed those relationships belonged to Anderson. I knew they belonged to trust. And trust remembers who earned it. I signed the Walsh offer letter on a Friday afternoon. The following Monday, Richard called me into his office and cut my salary in half. The timing was so perfect, I almost laughed. The conference room felt smaller that morning. Or perhaps Richard simply took up more space when he thought he was winning. He did not offer me a seat. I pulled one out and sat down anyway. He shuffled his papers once more. A habit he had when delaying the moment before delivering something he had already prepared. Then he looked at me with that flat expression and said my name in the tone he used when he wanted to remind me that I was staff. Not real family. He said he would get straight to the point. My salary was being cut in half. Effective immediately. Take it or leave it. I kept my face calm. More than 2 decades of reading pressure gauges and tolerance specifications had taught me that small variations often signal larger problems. In that moment, the largest problem in the room was not mine. I simply asked when the decision took effect. A flicker crossed Richard's face. He had expected anger, pleading, or fear. What he got was calm. And that calm disrupted him. Richard said the decision took effect immediately, then leaned back and told me he was sure I understood the company's position. I nearly had to remind myself not to smile too visibly. Anderson had just posted a record profit quarter, largely because of the lean systems my teams and I had implemented over the previous 3 years. Cumulatively, my operational improvements had saved the company more than $4 million. The salary cut Richard proposed would save him roughly $60,000 a year. So it was never about money. It was about power. I stood and told him he had opened my eyes to many things. His chest expanded slightly. He thought I was thanking him. He said family came first. Always. I answered. Always. Then I walked to the door, placed my hand on the handle, turned back, and said I hoped Ethan and Mason found their footing soon, because running that operation was much harder than it looked from the outside. Richard nodded slowly, as though I had complimented his sons. I walked out, took out my phone, and texted Caroline 2 words ready. Chicago. Less than a minute later, she replied that she would see me there. The Manufacturing Excellence Conference in Chicago was 11 days away. Anderson Automotive was the platinum sponsor of the conference that year, which meant Richard would deliver the keynote on the second morning in front of nearly every significant person in the Midwest automotive supply chain. Suppliers, procurement directeur, plant managers, and engineers would all be there. The same people who had heard Richard Vale's name attached to operational innovations he had never created himself. Caroline had secured a speaking slot immediately after Richard's session. The previous speaker had withdrawn because of budget constraints, and Caroline later told me it took exactly 1 phone call to obtain the opening. In the 11 days between the salary cut meeting and Chicago, I completed the formal transition. I signed the Walsh paperwork, met with my attorney, one final time to confirm that everything was clean, and handed off my Anderson responsibilities in writing detailed, professional, thorough, and leaving no room for anyone to claim I had abandoned the work. Hank Owens called me the day before I flew out. Hank was the local UAW representative. We had worked together for 6 years and built something many managers never build with union leadership: actual respect. He had heard through the floor that I was leaving. News inside a plant travels faster than administrative email. He asked whether I was doing what he thought I was doing. I told him probably. Hank went quiet for a moment, then said the Vale boys had no idea what was about to happen to that place. I said they would figure it out eventually. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. He told me 3 senior skilled workers had already asked him about the Walsh operation after hearing I was headed there. I asked what he told them. Hank said he told them Walsh ran a clean shop and treated people like adults. Then he added that he had also told them nothing was official yet. I told him to give me 2 weeks. Hank said he would be at the conference because he wanted to see it in person. I told him to sit up front. I flew into Chicago on a Thursday evening, checked into the conference hotel, and walked the convention center floor after the welcome reception had cleared. Before important days, I like to place the space in my mind. The main hall was already prepared for the next morning's keynote. Anderson's platinum sponsor banner hung near the entrance, large and blue, with the Vale logo in white. I stood there looking at it for a while. More than 2 decades. Every efficiency rating. Every supplier relationship. Every early morning and missed dinner. All of it had built something with their family name on it. Not mine. Theirs. That night, I thought about the 4-page report still sitting in my drawer. The one I had written 8 weeks before the Ford shipment disaster. I thought about Richard's 3-word reply. I thought about Ethan's calm face in the emergency meeting. The way he shifted blame toward me without even flushing. I thought about Daniel at the kitchen table, believing everything was fine because his father still sat in the seat of power. Then I put all of it down. I had spent enough time being angry over what Anderson had taken from me. What was coming next was no longer anger. It was quieter than that. Like a calculation that had been running in the background for a long time, finally producing its result. I ordered room service, ate simply, and went to sleep early. The next morning, Richard took the stage at 9 o'clock sharp. I sat in the 4th row, center section, holding a cup of coffee with a clear view of the podium. The room held about 500 people: suppliers, plant managers, procurement directeur, and engineers. People who understood the difference between manufacturing excellence in practice and manufacturing excellence in a presentation. Richard looked comfortable. He always looked comfortable when he did not have to personally fix the problems his decisions created. He spoke about growth, traditional values, and proven methods. I counted him using the phrase proven approach 4 times. The applause after Richard's speech was polite. The kind a room gives to honor protocol rather than genuine admiration. He shook the moderator's hand, stepped back from the podium, and scanned the audience with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had reminded everyone why he mattered. Then Caroline Walsh walked out. She did not need a long introduction. Half the room already knew who she was, and the other half understood quickly. Caroline said she wanted to talk about the difference between maintaining yesterday's operation and actually building tomorrow's. She paused just long enough, and then said those were not the same thing. And in this industry, the gap between them was widening every year. She spoke about Walsh's Midwest expansion and what modern automotive supply chain management truly required. Not slogan, but real operational specifics. The room changed the way it listened. People leaned forward instead of sitting back. Then Caroline advanced to the next slide. She said an expansion like this required the right kind of leadership: people who had spent decades earning the trust of suppliers, customers, and labor. Not because of whose name was on the building, but because of what they delivered day after day when no one was watching and the line still had to run. Then she looked out at the audience and introduced me. Olivia Crane, the new Vice President of Manufacturing Innovation at Walsh Manufacturing. I stood. The applause began before I had taken 3 steps toward the aisle. It was not the polite applause reserved for a sponsor. It was real applause, growing louder as people connected my name with systems they had heard about, problems they had seen solved, and a reputation that had moved through the industry for years without my needing to advertise myself. Hank Owens was in the front row exactly where I had told him to sit. As I passed, he stood and gave me one firm nod. No words were needed. I walked onto the stage and shook Caroline's hand at the podium. Behind me, somewhere near the back of the room, I heard a small sound. Not a word. Just air, leaving someone's lungs. The specific sound a man makes when he realizes the ground beneath him has shifted, and he was not ready for it. I did not turn around. I did not need to see Richard's face to know what was on it. Caroline said a few more things about the Detroit plan, the timeline, and the partnerships already in place. I kept my remarks brief. Thanked the industry relationships that had made my career possible. Said I was looking forward to what came next. And meant every word. When we walked off stage, the conference continued, as conferences do, but in the hallway, something else had already begun moving. My phone had 11 messages before I reached the coffee station. 6 months later, I stood on the production floor of Walsh Manufacturing's new Detroit facility, watching lines run at 97% efficiency. The numbers told their own story. Walsh captured most of Anderson's major accounts within 5 months. Not because we pursued them dishonestly, but because those relationships had been built over more than 2 decades, and they followed the person who had built them. Sharon Torres moved her contracts within 45 days of my start date. Brenda Sloan followed 3 weeks later. Clint Ruiz held out the longest, 6 weeks. Then called me directly and said he had always known he would end up there. Hank helped transition 31 skilled workers who had been laid off when Anderson's production volume dropped. Every step was clean and professional. Ethan hired a consulting firm to stabilize Anderson's operations. The firm recommended implementing the same lean manufacturing framework I had proposed to Richard 2 years earlier and been overruled on. Mason sent me a LinkedIn connection request. I left it pending. Richard called once and left a voicemail about misunderstandings and moving forward. I listened to the whole thing, which was more than he deserved. Then deleted it without calling back. If there is one thing I would tell any woman who has ever been treated as invisible, it is this. Your record does not disappear because someone stops acknowledging it. When people cut your value in half, they are telling you exactly how they see you. And when the market says otherwise, believe the place that sees you clearly. Thank you for watching until the end. If this story resonated with you, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.